Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about different types of representations in another way. Um, the main sort of distinctions that distinguish different types of representations, right? So we can think of there's digital and analog representations, right? For example, a digital clock, right, represents numbers, and it represents digital representations will represent information in a discrete fashion with finite units. So for a clock it's representing distinct numbers if it's digital. Whereas, and for MP3 players, the music is supposedly represented with a series of ones and zeros. At least that's what I've been told. I don't know much about how they're represented, but except for that. Um, And one characteristic about digital representations is that they're less affected by small variations, such as temperature fluctuations, electrical interference, or mechanical imperfections. Um, so, analog representations represent information in a more continuous form, right? So, for a clock, the time is represented by the position of its hands on the clock dial. So, is it in this example, is it 12:15 exactly? Well, I don't know. It's not exactly 12:15. It's sort of continuous in that sense. Um, Whereas for a digital clock, it is exactly 12:15, maybe, right? So yeah, time is represented by the position of its hands on the clock dial, right? And for records, right, old school records, vinyl, music is represented by based on the ridges of the record. So unlike digital representations, they're much more susceptible to degradation and noise, and also the precision of the representation is determined by the quality of the system. So, um, yeah, if the record or the record player is not very good, then that's going to affect the quality and precision of how that information is represented. Whereas it's the that's less of an issue, I think, with digital representations. So additionally, analog, so just yeah, additionally, analog representations resemble the physical structure or appearance of what they represent. So they have a direct, continuous relationship with the object or concept. So in the example of a record, right, the grooves shapes on a record directly correspond to the sound waves that the record produces. Um, in contrast, digital representations use abstract symbols or codes to represent the information, and they don't necessarily resemble the object, but can be interpreted or used to recreate that information or recreate the object. We can also talk, another sort of distinction is whether the representations are symbolic or non-symbolic. I don't really like the word non-symbolic, even though it gets used that way. I just like the word imagistic, right? That's how I think about it. So symbolic representations, these are some examples of them here, right? And really, you have to remember symbols are everywhere, right? I think we take for granted how much we use symbols. And so some of these symbols bear absolute hardly any resemblance or relationship to the things that they're representing, right? Like the number four, how does that mean four? It doesn't really, right? What is this? I don't know what this Russian word, I think it's Russian, but this means something, but I don't know what it is. And it's not obvious what it would be like, right? Car, if you didn't know English, you wouldn't know that it meant that. And it's arbitrary that it means car because in other languages, it's totally different symbol, right? The cat on the chair is another way to represent some. But again, these are all sort of arbitrary symbols that have no mapping necessary. They have no obvious resemblance to the things that they're supposed to represent, kind of like digital representations, right? Which is a hint, right? Um, but then, there are other symbols where you kind of know why they mean that, right? So, like, this is handicapped and it's supposed to look like kind of like a wheelchair. This is the no smoking sign. Okay, this is no eating. Okay, there's silverware. This is what's it called? A save button, which by the way is a skew. It's called a skeuomorph because we don't use floppy disks anymore. So it's an outdated symbol, but we still know what it means. Yeah, so these we know what these are, but they kind of bear some similarity to the thing that they're supposed to represent, but there are other things that don't bear any resemblance really, and they're kind of arbitrary. And if you recall, the first wave of cognitive science assumed that humans represent information with symbols, which can be combined to create propositions, right? And that computers represent information in a symbolic fashion, such as with propositions, which in turn are ultimately represented with ones or zeros, right? Um, yeah, so the first wave of cognitive science didn't really seem to acknowledge or be very enthusiastic with the idea that we can represent things imagistically, right? So, imagistically are these things on the right, right? So, four dots, that is something, right? That could represent four in my mind, right? Um, car, this is a picture of a car, so it bears a lot of resemblance to the thing that it's representing. Cat on the chair, right? That's an image of a cat on the chair. So it's like it resembles the thing that it's supposed to be representing, or it resembles it resembles the thing it's supposed to be representing. Um, and so yeah, if you were to a side note, right? The one question is like, what to what extent can humans represent things imagistically? You probably, when you think of something, you can probably form some sort of image. If I were to ask you to imagine what an apple looks like, many of you could probably do this to some extent, right? Um, and if you can't do this, then you may have what's called aphantasia, which affects 2 to 4% of the population, where they can't form mental images. Okay, aside from that, um, so I've been talking though as though a little bit like symbolic versus non-symbolic is a separate distinction from digital and analog, but in reality, they're kind of similar, right? Types of representations are kind of interconnected or dependent and kind of mean the same thing. So, like, in other words, we think of analog representations as basically imagistic representations. Um, if you think about how precision varies much more with analog representations, it kind of makes sense that imagistic representations are likely to be analog, right? If you think of a painting, it can get ruined, whereas a digital representation of a painting would be less susceptible to decay, right? Um, yeah, digital representations are likely to be symbolic, basically, and are much as such, they're also sometimes called propositional representations. Um, So yeah, and also you can think of not only are imagistic and analog representations somewhat synonymous, but they're also synonymous with concrete. So concrete representations, analog representations, imagistic representations, right? You can imagine something that's concrete, whereas with symbolic, digital, or propositional representations, these are considered to be more abstract because they represent information using arbitrary symbols that do not, like I said, resemble what the referent actually is, right? And so, whereas imagistic representations are considered to be concrete because they more closely resemble the referent. Um, yeah, and so this is what I'm saying here. If this is the city of Mankato, right? This is the referent that is Mankato, and it resembles the imagistic representation of Mankato, whereas the digital representation doesn't. Right, so an imagistic representation of a city will represent information in a way that resembles the region. In contrast, a digital representation of a city will represent information that will not resemble the region. So, yeah, if you think about how analog representations tend to resemble the physical thing that they are meant to represent, it makes sense that imagistic representations are likely to be analog as well as concrete. In contrast, digital representations do not necessarily resemble the thing that they represent, which is why they are likely to be symbolic slash propositional slash abstract. Then here's just another example, right? So we already kind of did this, right? So the referent of a cat, it resembles the imagistic representation of a cat, whereas the referent of, cash doesn't necessarily resemble the um, digital slash propositional symbolic representation of money, right? Okay, sorry that went a little over. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next one.